Transparency plays an incredibly important role right now as we try to exercise democratic control over the police.
Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. I'm with Dan Barrett, NEFAC board member, as well as legal director of the ACLU of Connecticut. In a moment, Dan's going to help us understand the role of transparency in this national conversation about police misconduct and how to hold law enforcement agencies, not just in New England, but throughout the country, responsible for their actions. First, a couple announcements. NEFAC finally is on Instagram. Please check us out, NE First Amendment Coalition. Also, many have been asking about our annual New England First Amendment Institute. We will be having our 10th annual institute this fall. More details forthcoming. I expect by the end of the month, we'll release the dates of the institute, how it'll be structured, and how you can apply. For those not familiar with the program, it really is a special, exclusive program that we have every year where we invite 25 journalists working in New England to learn from some of the best reporters, editors, attorneys, if not in the region, then in the country. They come in and they teach all of the latest on investigative journalism. An incredible program. I would encourage everyone, if you haven't done so already, please go to nefac.org, hit subscribe, and you'll get all of the updates, including all of the relevant information you need to apply to this year's institute. Again, we're here with Dan Barrett of the ACLU of Connecticut. Dan, let's get right into it. We're seeing protests in the streets. We have this now groundswell of momentum toward police reform. Can you help us better understand what role transparency plays in preventing police misconduct, whether it's the excessive use of force that results in the killing of an individual or things that may appear more benign but still betray the public's trust?
Sure. So I think transparency plays an incredibly important role right now as we try to exercise democratic control over the police. I want to be clear that I don't think transparency itself is the thing that's going to change or prevent incidences of violence that we've seen over the last few years. There's been some horrific incidences of violence that have been fully captured on body cam. But it's a related topic in that transparency, just like any other part of the government, helps us to assert democratic control over the police, just as we do over, the mayor's office or the, Department of Public Works or something like that. So oversight through transparency is a key component of democratic control, and that's where it really becomes important. As we have discussions now, for example, about police funding, about police practices, well, you have to have access to some of the documents that show you what's actually happening with those things. Like in your town, you need access to figure out what your police budget is, and you couldn't get that without, open records law.
So tell us a little bit more about these open record laws. For those that aren't familiar with these types of laws and what they provide the public, can you tell us a little bit about how they work and more specifically what kind of information they could provide us about law enforcement or even more specifically, the misconduct of certain officers?
Sure. So open records laws across New England work to guarantee the public access to certain government records. And, every state in New England has a statute, and basically they came about, typically in the 70s when people figured out that without some kind of law, there was no real way to force the government to give us any information. And that runs from really basic stuff like how are you spending public dollars, all the way up to more advanced stuff like personnel records. And so in my own mind, I think there's two kind of categories of things that public records laws can really help us with as we go through this discussion about the role of the police in our society and holding them accountable no matter what role we ultimately decide that they play. The first is more general, and it's what you might think of as management and direction records. And so, for example, you may have a question about your hometown police department, like, well, when does it decide to discipline employees, or what threshold does an employee have to reach before they get disciplined? That's stuff that you can figure out by getting the policies and procedures of the department and figure out exactly what procedure they follow. For example, when somebody makes a complaint about an employee, or when the police department becomes aware that the employee has done something wrong. So those kind of like management and oversight type records. And then, as you say, Justin, there's a second level, more granular, of records relating to a specific employee. So a person's performance record, their record of complaints, their records of discipline. You can go right down and say, okay, this guy's in the news. What is it that he has done in the last few years? So it's both the macro and the micro that you get with an open records.
Right. So these records, it sounds like they provide a tremendous amount of insight into how law enforcement agencies work. But are they all accessible to us under these public record laws? Or are there certain exemptions at play? What challenges, if any, do members of the public have in getting this information?
I think there's sort of three big challenges when we think about using public records laws, and especially when it comes to police, because police agencies tend to be the most energetically resistant to oversight, and that includes in responding to open records requests, and they frequently litigate them because they just don't want the public to know what's going on. But there are kind of, I think, three big barriers. The first is time and effort. And so, media lawyers and open records fans and journalists all know that there's a difference between a record being available and a record being published. And so most of the stuff that the public needs to really understand how its police department works is available, but it's not published. And so that means the person has to go through the effort of contacting the police department, making a request, and kind of following through with the legwork. That's time and effort, and that's a huge barrier. Many of the things that would be very useful in the discussion about police oversight, restructuring the role of police, really should be published by the police themselves. I'll give you an example. We were talking a second ago about police practices and procedures, manuals, or policies. Those are frequently not published online. So if you want to know what your hometown police department does, let's say with a complaint, how it processes a complaint, that's probably a chapter in their kind of big book of policies and procedures, but they never put it online. So you have to go and ask for it. You may have to pay some fee on a per page basis, depending on what state you're in. That's a big one. Then there are two things, that we call it, exemptions or exceptions to Open Records Acts. And across New England, there's two broad categories that will come into play when we talk about police records. The first is there's often a personnel records exemption that is in play. And if you're looking for whether or not a specific employee has ever been disciplined, a lot of times the employer is going to say, oh, we can't give it to you because there's a personnel exemption. Now, across New England, our personnel exemptions tend to be pretty good. Our personnel exemptions in New England tend not to completely exempt records, but they may exempt portions of records relating to a person's job performance. The second big one is that the kind of investigatory records exemption that tends to apply to police departments. And often what we will see, I'm sure journalists have run into this, lawyers have too, is that the police will try to cast every record as kind of an investigatory record. And so, for example, if an employee is out doing something on the job and commits some act of misconduct, oftentimes the police agency will tell a public records requester, oh, we can't give it to you because the records had to do with an investigation that employee was undertaking. And so ultimately those often prove to be baseless, but again, it's more that time and effort that a person needs to put into. But as you bring up, during this time of our national discussion over democratic control of police, people really ought to think hard about whether or not we still need these exemptions. They're being used by the government in a variety of areas to really stifle feedback and control by the people.
So what do we do about this secrecy? Ultimately, what can we do other than supporting organizations like NEFAC, ACLU, and other transparency advocates? What can the public do to get access to this information to make sure when there are instances of misconduct, we all know what happened, we know why it happened, and most importantly, we know what's being done to prevent it from happening again?
Well, I think there's a few things to do. I mean, the first is, I think people who are concerned about this area, and it's a very important area of governmental oversight generally, is really to talk to their local elected officials, because they're the ones who have a good deal of control over police agencies. And you want to raise, I think, a couple of things. The first is if the police agency, as many here in Connecticut do, has a terrible record on transparency, we really want to make sure lawmakers know that, because what we find ourselves in now, this national conversation, we the people are kind of, and we the journalists and everybody else are at a deficit, because we don't have access to the information that we need in order to really have this conversation and this discussion about what role we want the police to have in this country. The second is, honestly, it's very important, even though it's a lot of work, to actually ask for these records and to follow through and do the legwork and figure out how you can get your hands on them. I think as you know better than I, in many areas of government transparency, the government's strategy is to just wear down requesters and assume that no one's going to go through the trouble of actually seeking the records. Especially today, as journalism organizations are just under incredible budget constraints, that tactic has been paying off because journalists have 10 jobs to do now instead of one. So it is important to follow through. And the last is that we really should discuss, even in parallel with this conversation about the role of police in our society and whether we ought to be giving the police some of the responsibilities that they currently have, we ought to have a parallel discussion about maximizing public access to government information, not just with the police, but as we've seen during the pandemic, we had local governments across New England, let's say, refusing to tell people how many people were tested, how many people tested positive. Really vital information. With the police, it's life and death because they have the capability of going out and inflicting great harm on people. But it stretches down into other areas of the government as well. And so I think people ought to take it up with their elected representatives that we should really think whether we need so many exemptions to every state's open records law. Depending on the state, Connecticut has a few dozen, Vermont has far more than that, and then in other states, the number can vary. So we ought to have a real discussion about whether the default should be everyone gets to see government information with only a really few exceptions.
Great suggestions. Certainly a very important conversation to have, and hopefully now we have some momentum to really make some progress on these issues. So Dan, thank you for putting it all in context for us and providing this kind of insight. Really helpful. Appreciate all the work that you do and everything you do on behalf of NEFAC. Thank you again.
No problem. Good to talk to you, Justin.